Welcome back everybody, I'm Jaran Gabba, your host, and today going to react to the video called Cobra Commander, The Dark Origin G.I. Joe Never Showed You. Now for new updates and content you can visit the links in the description down below, and let's get started. Enjoy.
See how G.I. Joe likes the bite of a sneak's fangs.
Cobra Commander was never the villain they told you he was. The Origin, Marvel Comics, published in 1988, G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero, number 69, revealed that behind that mask was not a megalomaniac, not a military defector, not a product of any laboratory. It was a used car salesman, a man with a dead brother and a guilt he could never confront directly. A man who founded a self-help group, watched it radicalize, and then put on a hood so he would never have to answer for any of it by name. The Sunbow animated series, 5 seasons, 1983 to 1987, never showed you one frame of that story. Not one. The networks decided you weren't ready. What they buried was the most human horror story in the entire G.I. Joe franchise. Not a monster born from science or sorcery. A man produced by something simpler and considerably darker. The specific weight of a choice made at a crash site on a night nobody was supposed to remember. If buried TV history, the version they decided you couldn't handle, is what you come here for, not months later. Now.
Fire insurance is expensive, Destro. I would say billions.
The buffoon they sold you. You knew Cobra Commander the way they engineered you to know him. The hissing voice, the theatrical rages across the command deck, the silver mask or the blue hood, depending on which version of the nightmare occupied the top of Cobra's pyramid that particular Saturday. He was the screaming center of a global terrorist organization, perpetually humiliated by soldiers with code names and color-coordinated uniforms. The villain you were permitted to laugh at a little, the one the show told you not to take entirely seriously. That was the design. It worked precisely as intended. Destro rolled his eyes. The Baroness carried the actual menace. Serpentor eventually arrived to signal that even Cobra's inner circle had exhausted its patience with the Commander's failures. Cobra Commander was the loudest presence in any room, and somehow still the least feared figure in it. The cartoon guaranteed that outcome. They gave him elaborate schemes, weapons platforms that should have been decisive, and legions of faceless troops. But they gave him no gravity, no history, no wound that explained the volume. He wanted to rule the world. The writers asked you to accept that as sufficient explanation. You did, because you were a child, and the adventure moved too fast for you to examine the architecture underneath it. The architecture was load-bearing, and it was missing its entire foundation. There is a specific night, one decision, 30 seconds of choice, that produced everything that followed. A crash site on a road, a man who was present at the scene, and a man who got back in his car and drove away. The entire mythology of Cobra begins at that crash site, and the animated series never once acknowledged that it existed.
Let me show you the quickest exit.
The nobody who started everything. Before the mask, before the title, before a single Cobra trooper swore an oath to a cause that hadn't yet been formally named, there was a man. The Marvel Comics Origin never assigns him a name. That erasure is deliberate. It is the first structural piece of the horror. He is everyman. He is nobody. He is the figure you passed on a used car lot in 1975 who seemed slightly too eager, slightly too invested in closing the deal before you changed your mind. He is American in the most specific and uncomfortable sense of that word. He grew up in the shadow of an older brother, a Vietnam veteran, and that shadow functioned simultaneously as a source of pride and as a wound he lacked the tools to properly examine. The brother went to war when the country called. The brother came back changed, in the particular way men returned from that specific conflict, carrying something invisible and heavy that the nation that sent them had no language available to receive, and no infrastructure built to hold. Here is what you need to hold on to, because it becomes critical later. The brother story is not a footnote to this origin. It is the original document from which everything else proceeds. Everything Cobra Commander ever became is downstream from what happened to that veteran first. The animated series buried his story just as completely as it buried his brother's. That full accounting exists. It is coming. America in the post-Vietnam years was a nation that had dispatched its sons to die for a cause it could not fully defend, and then requested that those same sons remain quiet about what the experience had cost them. There was no national architecture for what those men carried home. No language. No ceremony that acknowledged the specific weight of what that war had asked of people. The older brother paid that price in full. Our man, the future commander, watched it happen from the closest possible distance, in the same house over years, without the capacity to intervene in any meaningful way. Somewhere in that watching, in the sustained helplessness of witnessing damage he had no tools to repair, he began accumulating a grievance that had no single address. He blamed the government. He blamed the system that had sent his brother and then abandoned him on return. The resentment had genuine roots in genuine injury. That is the part that matters most, and that is the part the cartoon could never show you, because the cartoon needed you to feel nothing for this man except contempt. The cartoon needed a buffoon, not a case study. His anger was not fabricated. His brother's suffering was real. What went wrong was not the origin of the pain. What went wrong was the direction he eventually aimed it.
You were saying something about fighting fearlessly, rust breath?
The night he drove away. The guilt that consumed him was not the clean grief of a man who watched suffering he could not have prevented. It was something more specific, more corrosive, and more difficult to live with. The guilt of a man who had a choice available at a critical moment, made the wrong one, and then spent the rest of his life unable to fully face what that meant. His brother died in a car crash. That is the documented fact from the Marvel Comics record. But the unbearable weight beneath that fact was this. He was there, present at the scene, and he left. He drove away from his brother at the precise moment when the outcome was still uncertain, when staying might have changed the result. And that single decision became the fracture point at which his identity began its permanent collapse. There is no forgiveness architecture available for that specific category of guilt. Not without confronting it directly. Not without sitting inside the catastrophic discomfort of your own specific culpability and remaining there until something resolves. He was not capable of that. The evidence suggests most people placed in that position are not capable of it. That is precisely what makes this origin function as a human document, rather than a comic book mechanic. So he did what wounded men sometimes do when the internal accounting becomes too devastating to complete honestly. He reassigned the debt. If the government had not sent his brother to Vietnam, the brother would not have returned broken. If the brother had not returned broken, the specific circumstances that produced that night on the road would never have assembled themselves. The government was therefore responsible. The system was therefore responsible. Every institution, every comfortable authority, every person who had never paid the price he and his brother had paid. The debt now belonged to all of them. That is the mechanism. That is the complete answer to how a used car salesman's private grief becomes a global terrorist organization. It is not ideology in any principled sense. It is not coherent politics. It is a man who could not survive the weight of one specific choice, who found a way to convert his personal crime into a universal indictment. The crash site produced the commander, not any laboratory, not any government program. A night on a road, a set of car keys, and a decision about whether to stop or keep driving. The logic of the reassignment is not sound, but it is deeply, recognizably human, because most of us have, at smaller scale and with smaller consequences, moved a debt from our own ledger to someone else's when the honest accounting became too uncomfortable. He moved it further than anyone else in the history of the franchise. He moved it far enough to build an army around it.
Mass device my foot. You've wasted millions of hard-stolen dollars, you titanium-faced turkey.
The self-help group that became Cobra. He did not immediately reach for power or weapons. He reached first for community. He founded a self-help organization. He called it the Friends of Peace. Read that name with the full weight it deserves. It is the name of something that began with genuine grief and genuine disillusionment. It was populated by real people who had their own legitimate reasons to distrust the machinery of American institutional life. Some of their pain was entirely valid. That is the part that should make you pause before you continue, because it is the part that makes what follows most uncomfortable. The Friends of Peace did not stay peaceful. That is not a surprise ending. That is the inevitable consequence of the architecture he built. Radicalization never unfolds in a single dramatic moment. It unfolds through a gradual redefinition of what the cause requires, a slow narrowing of what counts as acceptable, a steady expansion of who counts as the enemy, an incremental erosion of the limits that separate grievance from violence. He was charismatic. The failed car salesman, it turned out, possessed a gift that the used car lot had fundamentally wasted. He could make people believe. He could gather the grieved and the disillusioned and give their pain a coherent narrative, a clear direction, a defined and shared enemy. Once you give a group of wounded people a shared enemy, you have crossed a threshold that is very difficult to approach from the other side. The Friends of Peace became something else, something with its own momentum now, something that no longer required his continuous direction to keep escalating. The radicalization fed on its own internal logic, a grievance structure with no external break, no figure of authority he respected enough to be corrected by, no moment of grace capable of interrupting the forward motion. He had constructed a world in which his own guilt was permanently reclassified as someone else's crime. He had found an audience that needed exactly that architecture as desperately as he did. Cobra was born from that momentum, not from a laboratory, not from a supernatural agreement, from a self-help organization that gradually forgot what it had originally been trying to help.
New York still stands. My threat has been proven empty.
What the hood actually means. The mask came last. Consider carefully what the mask actually means, now that you have the full sequence. It is not the armor of a supervillain in the comic book tradition. It is not transformation in the way a radioactive accident transforms a man into something other than what he was. It is concealment. It is the deliberate, final burial of the face of that unnamed man. The car salesman, the brother who drove away from the crash scene, the founder of an organization that became a mechanism for exactly the kind of violence he had originally claimed to oppose. The hood goes on. The name disappears. The man who could be held accountable for specific things on a specific night becomes a title, a symbol, an ideology with no face attached to it. That is the transaction he completed, not with a dark power from outside himself, with the darkest power available to any human being. The decision to stop being identifiable so that he would never again have to be accountable. His name is never recorded in the Marvel Comics origin. That is not a gap in the research. That is the entire architecture of the story.
I'll see how G.I. Joe likes the bite of a sneak's fangs.
Why they kept it from you. Marvel Comics published this origin in 1988. By that year, the children who had been watching the Sunbow animated series since its debut in 1983 were no longer children in the way they had been at the beginning. 5 years of the franchise. Some of them were teenagers by 1988. Some of them had older brothers. Some of them had fathers who had come back from Vietnam carrying that invisible weight the country had never built the language to properly receive. The readership was ready for this story. The readership had, in many cases, lived in close proximity to exactly this story. The Sunbow animated series never addressed it. Not one episode across the entire run. The producers and the network made the collective determination that this specific origin, a man abandoning his brother at a crash site, founding a radicalization vehicle out of projected guilt, converting genuine grief into organized global violence, was too morally complex, too ambiguous, too close to something that actually existed in the real world. They kept the hissing voice. They kept the theatrical rages and the perpetually unrealized schemes. They kept the buffoon because the buffoon asks nothing from the audience except laughter and the reliable satisfaction of watching the Joes win again. The buffoon has no crash site. The buffoon has no brother. The buffoon has no unnamed self buried deliberately under a hood to avoid the specific accountability of a specific night on a specific road. What the animated series gave you was a product. What Marvel buried in issue number 69 was a mirror. A man destroyed not by an external force, but by the specific gravity of unconfronted guilt, by the human capacity to convert private failure into public war. That suppression held for the entire classic run. Later adaptations gave Cobra Commander a human origin, but a different one, a different construction, with different mechanics. The specific sequence from the Marvel Comics, the brother, Vietnam, the crash, the abandonment, the friends of peace, the radicalization, never reached the screen in any form that found the audience that grew up on Saturday mornings with the hissing voice and the unrealized schemes. You were given the mask. They kept the man.
There will be dire consequences for you if you do not obey my orders!
More frightening or less? Here is the question this places you in front of, and it does not have a comfortable answer. Does knowing this make Cobra Commander more frightening or less? Is less frightening as pure evil? Pure evil requires nothing from you. No comprehension, no recognition, no uncomfortable moment of proximity. But he is significantly more frightening as a wounded man, because wounded men are not rare. The specific sequence of events that produced him is not a fantasy construct with no correspondence to how human beings actually function. Guilt, displaced into grievance, is not a comic book mechanic. The radicalization of genuine pain into something that damages the world at scale is a pattern that predates the 1980s by a considerable distance and has shown no sign of becoming less operational in the decades since. The hood means something different now. It is not the uniform of a supervillain. It is the final act of a man who could not continue to exist under his own name. That image, the hood going on, the name disappearing, the unnamed man converting himself into a symbol, is the most psychologically disturbing visual in the entire G.I. Joe mythology, and it never made it to the screen. The grave nobody was supposed to visit. Did you ever sense, watching that hissing figure on Saturday morning, that something was absent? That the cartoon villain was somehow less than what the toy in your hand suggested he could be?
So that was Cobra Commander, the dark origin G.I. Joe never showed you. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I must say, I never knew the story of Cobra Commander, and I've never watched G.I. Joe, a real American hero. The only experience of G.I. Joe that I've ever had is when I watched the 1987 G.I. Joe animated movie with Don Johnson as Lieutenant Falcon, and G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra, and G.I. Joe, Retaliation. I've never watched the independent Snake Eyes movie as well. But if I have to say, in the other live action movie, Snake Eyes was my favorite character. I never knew Cobra Commander was a car salesman, and the fact that his brother got killed in a car accident and him fleeing from the scene, now I can understand why he turned out the way he did. And the fact that Cobra Commander founded Cobra, and before it was named Cobra, it was named Friends of Peace. I didn't know that. And we all know what Cobra stands for: conversion by blackmail, revolution and anarchy. And G.I. Joe stands for Government Issue Joe. I've got all the episodes of G.I. Joe, I just need to watch it. And a word of wisdom for today. Like the Joe says, Yo Joe! Have a blessed day further, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.